Thank you very much. I'm an economist in a sea of lawyers, and so I'm going to try and earn my keep by introducing you, through what I'm going to say, to a couple of concepts which are fundamental to public policy and second nature to economists, but probably not familiar to lawyers. When lawyers look at an activity, your big conceptual distinction is it legal or not? Economists, actually, that's of no interest at all. Economists ask, is it productive or not? And we're particularly interested in that set of activities which is unproductive but privately profitable. And we give those a name, they're called rent-seeking activities. Now, rent-seeking activities are very bad news for societies because all the money that is earned by the people engaged in them, the private returns, accrue because there are losses to everybody else in society. And so rent-seeking activities have to be discouraged. Some of them, thank goodness, are illegal. You rob a bank, that's rent-seeking, it's illegal. It turns out that the illegal activities, actually, they're not really the central problem. One reason is that the people who do illegal activities are dumb, and so they're criminals. But criminals tend to be pretty dumb, and so they're not very productive anywhere else. But the legal rent-seeking activities attract some of the cleverest people on earth, and that is a tragedy. They're using their exceptional talents to plunder others, whereas mostly in the productive economy, the high-ability people are even more socially productive than they are privately productive. So the most talented people engaged in the productive sector produce a surplus for others as well as high incomes themselves. And the high talent in the legal but rent-seeking sector is a menace twice over. It directly plunders, and it has this opportunity cost of shriveling the productive high-talent sector of its labor force. Now, I start with that because one of the rent-seeking activities is, of course, tax avoidance and the sectors which advise on that. It's by no means the only legal rent-seeking activity. For example, high-frequency trading in the financial sector, since we're in the City of London, I should mention, is exactly a rent-seeking activity. It's privately very profitable, socially completely useless. And so, as a rent-seeking activity, is to be discouraged. And I should say that public policies which shrink the rent-seeking sector are pro-business, not anti-business. Because the business sector you want is the productive sector of the economy. And the productive sector of the economy is doing the paying for the rent-seeking profits. So, if we turn to the tax avoidance sector, the people who devised the double Irish must have been some of the cleverest people on earth. And in the line of one of the previous speakers' comments, do their children know what they did? Do they understand how socially destructive that was? All the gains from the double Irish, which have been huge, both for tax advisors and for the companies they've helped, have come as losses to society. All the gains. Right? It's a catastrophe. Right? It's happening on a very big scale. Just read this week's Financial Times, right? Monday, the biggest ever corporate bond issue. Apple, $90 billion corporate bond issue. What is the money going to be used for? It's going to be used to buy back Apple's equity. In other words, it's completely independent of the productive economy. The only rationale for it is that it will reduce Apple's tax bill. And so that brilliant idea, the biggest corporate bond issue ever, which will generate a lot of bonuses, I'm sure, and a lot of reduced tax bill for Apple, is just socially Rent-seeking, it's very costly. And so that was Monday. Then I guess Wednesday we had Pfizer's bid for AstraZeneca, and the initial core rationale for it was that this would reduce Pfizer's tax bill by shifting tax domicile, not shifting the headquarters. They're going to stay in New York, just shift the tax domicile. Rent-seeking. I'm sorry, but it's rent-seeking. So, these activities have to be recognized for what they are, and they have to be discouraged. Now, I do a lot of work with the financial sector, and the usual response of my colleagues in the financial sector is that basically, if it's legal, we're going to do it, and if you don't like it, then change the rules. Many people have said that to me. You don't like it, it's not useful, just change the rules. Now I'm going to tell you why that's not an adequate intellectual position for you to take. That there is an irreducible and quite a substantial need for professional ethics here. And the professional ethics concerned are the professional tax advisors. And why is that? There are three reasons. First, but they're all around the idea that it's such an uneven struggle between companies and tax authorities. And the key reason is that companies, the big companies are now international, and the tax systems have stayed national. And the tax systems are irreducibly national. What have we just heard? That overwhelmingly the motive, what motivates tax systems is domestic considerations. And so trying to harmonize tax systems, I commend the OECD for this effort to harmonize and counter base erosion. But it's an uphill struggle. And so companies, international companies, just have a big advantage. They will always be more fast-footed, able to game whatever governments do. And so that's the first reason why it's such an uneven fight. The second reason is look at the money. You can earn much higher incomes on one side of the struggle than on the other. And talent follows incomes. And so the people engaged on the corporate side are much better paid and generally smarter than the people who are trying to counter it. Right? Public sector salaries are way lower than the salaries in tax avoidance. And so it's the smart tend to defeat the less smart. That sounds great, except that remember the smart, if they're working in the rent-seeking sector, their job is to go home at night, say, your partner says, did you have a good day, dear? And yes, a good day means a bad day for society. International versus national, talented versus less talented, and then finally, the asymmetry which I'm concerned with is in the poorest countries on earth, where the capacity asymmetry is quite extraordinary. The typical poor country that I work with has virtually no tax capacity at all. And so they're a sitting duck for you. And this is potentially very dangerous because the big activity in poor countries is the exploitation of natural resources. This is their big chance, their one big chance the next decade, is to exploit the resources that have been discovered in the commodity booms of the previous decade. It's the one big chance. What we're finding is that the resource extraction companies, which are very necessary, they have the technical and financial skills to do this, they're vital. They are the custodians of the assets of the really poor. They're taking these natural resources out of the ground, but the resources belong to the citizens of these poor countries. And the way that value is transferred back to those citizens is through the tax system. And so if you bust through the tax system, which many of you here are perfectly capable of doing, given what you're facing, the lack of capacity you're facing, you're doing something which is legal but disgusting. Now, some companies, some resource extraction companies behave very ethically. But there's a tail of resource extraction companies which don't. You'll have read about some of them in the news recently. Right? And it's astonishing that some of those companies are able to get succor and assistance from public relations firms in the City of London, from tax advisors in the city. And that is shaming. So that's why it's an ethical issue, an irreducible ethical issue. Yes, we must change the laws, but that doesn't absolve you of ethics. Finally, let me turn to the second concept that I want to introduce. I've done rent-seeking. Now I want to introduce a new concept that's just out of Harvard Business School this last year. It's all the rage from Harvard Business School, and it's called relational contracts. And relational contracts are slightly misnamed because whatever relational contracts are, they're not legal contracts. Harvard's pioneered this by looking at what makes a successful company versus an unsuccessful company. And they found that success is persistent. You know, a company like GE just goes on and on being a good company. And what is it? And it turns out, according to Harvard Business School research, that it's good relationships between management and the workforce. And it's relationships which cannot be legally binding contracts. And so there's an element of trust built on both sides. Managers trust the workforce trusts the company, and that produces these astonishingly persistent productivity differentials between companies. Now, I want to suggest that that same concept of relational contracts applies between companies and governments. Good relational contracts within a company produce high productivity. Good relational contracts between companies and governments produce good societies. Good societies need high levels of tax to GDP, 40% plus. Below 40% tax to GDP, we cannot deliver a good life for ordinary people. Even America fails to do that. The living standards of the people below median income have actually been falling for the last 40 years. Right? So below about 40% tax, it just doesn't work. But to deliver 40% plus tax, the corporate sector has an irreducible role. And to conclude, yes, we have to change the laws, but there's an irreducible role for ethics. In the past 20 years, we've not just had base erosion, we've had ethics erosion. Thank you.